Thank you all for joining us for Youth Advocate Speaks. I'm Taller on the Inside. I'm Tatiana Pulsini, outpatient social worker and social work faculty at the UF Pediatric Pulmonary Center in Gainesville, Florida. The format for this session will be an interview. Closed captioning and ASL interpretation will be provided. We hope to have some time for questions at the end of our chat, so please save your questions or feel free to drop them in the chat and we will respond to them during our Q&A. Joining us today is Oliver Stabbe. Welcome, Oliver.
Hi, so happy to be here.
Happy to have you. I'm just going to do a brief intro for you, and then we'll get started with our interview. So Oliver is a public health advocate and researcher committed to social, economic, racial, gender, and deaf/disability justice and equity through legislative development, advocacy, and strategic action regarding social determinants of health for marginalized populations. Stabbe is currently pursuing a master's in public health at UC Berkeley and is a health policy advocacy fellow at the Center for Healthcare and Innovation, currently focused on the intersection of dementia, medical decision-making, and technology. Oliver also is a board member of DREAM, or the Disability Rights Education, Activism, and Mentoring Organization, where he is authoring a comprehensive toolkit for college students with disabilities looking to advocate for policy changes at their university. Oliver's work regarding social determinants of health has been published with Teen Vogue, Huffington Post, The Advocate, International Journal of Transgender Health, and more. In his free time, Stabbe enjoys bird watching, people watching, and watching people who enjoy bird watching. Welcome, Oliver. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
I love that last line about enjoying watching people who birdwatch. That's wonderful.
Every single time I give a presentation, I swap out that last sentence. I have a list of something like 50 lines long. So if you want to see what else is on my list, come to another presentation that I'm giving.
I'd be happy to. Okay, so to get us started for today, why don't you tell us a little about yourself and about what fueled your interest in a career in public health?
Sure. So I am a notoriously terrible planner. I kind of just stick my finger up in the air and figure out where the wind will carry me. I think that starting out, my biggest impact was growing up in Washington, D.C. It's a very political space. I was fortunate enough to secure an internship at the National Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where I worked in the Science and Medicine department under this amazing curator, Catherine Ott. So they focused on disability and LGBTQ history. So from there, I was working at the museum at the same time. The 25th anniversary of the ADA was being celebrated. And it was amazing because all of these disability advocates just came into the museum and it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I've been disabled for a very long time. I'm hard of hearing. Sometimes I identify myself as deaf. And I hadn't really seen anyone who was like myself before that. And it was such a magical experience for me to see how community had come together to celebrate something that had originated in a problem. Like the ADA passed because inaccessibility, because disabled people don't have what we need. We still don't most often, but we do have legal protections in some ways. So seeing that was really inspiring. So from there, I took another internship at National Council on Independent Living, also in DC. And so I looked at policies regarding people with disabilities and saw how larger systems impacted individual consumers in independent living centers all across the US. And from there, I kind of got roped into helping out with the first Women's March on Washington in the Disability Caucus. And again, I saw how community organizing and civil rights had so much power to it. But what really spoke to me was that there's our little caucus, our little subsection with our own culture, our own support, thinking through how everyone, regardless of disability, even because of their disability, how they could participate in a larger movement. And that really spoke to me because disabled people are often overlooked. We don't talk about social aspects of disability nearly enough. So I was part of the Disability Caucus. I moved away from DC. I went to University of Rochester. I had a double major in brain cognitive science, psychology, also American Sign Language. And I just thought the brains were interesting. I thought, you know what, I have no idea if I'm going to become a scientist, might as well. But I just developed more of an interest of what our environment does to our brain. So I was particularly curious about psycholinguistics and deaf populations. And then,
That is fascinating.
Post post college, I had no idea what I wanted to do, so I went into law, as one does, civil rights law.
Wow. I love how you were talking about how your small collective voice, like you were originally inspired by advocacy efforts of others, and then the voice of the small group you were working with ended up feeling like it was making really, really big changes and impacts on a larger scale. That really spoke to what we're doing here. So I really appreciated that response. To what extent, you mentioned that you're hard of hearing and you sometimes identify as deaf. To what extent has your hearing issues impacted your move towards independence? What challenges or obstacles did you have to overcome personally to get to this wonderful place that you're at right now?
Yes, so from the get-go, I tend to phrase my disability as an environmental disability. So I don't personally relate to the idea of having hearing issues because in that framing, it seems like I myself carry issues with me. When I'm fully accommodated for, when I have the services I need, I am not socially considered to be disabled. If I'm in a room full of people who sign, I'm not disabled. But that's not to say that disability is a bad thing. I think that there's a lot of stigma attached to it, but we overlook the way that our environments change how disabled people view themselves. So I think that regarding independence, there's a lot of extra burden on disabled people, for sure. Particularly going through medical systems as disabled people. It's hard to remember that these systems that we navigate aren't static. They don't have to be the way that they are. We all know the challenge of getting an insurance bill saying like, what the heck was that for? It doesn't have to be that way. We can change systems so that they can be accommodating and welcoming and supportive of people with disabilities. Being disabled doesn't have to be synonymous with suffering. So I think that the independence issues that I carry with me are largely based on social issues. Yeah, just having to carry that extra advocacy and chip on my shoulder a little bit and rely on that to keep myself going.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for saying that. I think it's often easy to assume that, you know, the burden lies to you, and really it's the collective like system that is responsible for making sure that all the voices can be heard and included in all of these discussions and settings that we're in. So the tagline of our discussion is taller on the inside, and I wanted to know what that means to you, because this was a personal phrase of yours that you use, correct?
Yes, it was a personal phrase. I said it at some point. It was published online, and the wonderful Helen Miney found it. So that is the title of this talk. So I think that it's really, we are every day, we are overloaded with constant information, and it's easy to, and what we tend to do is we make assumptions, and that's just a way of cutting out all of that extra information that doesn't relate to what we're trying to figure out. So it's easy to overlook the history of a person. We know what we know at face value. So you can look at me and think, oh, well, who is this 5'3" incredibly goofy person wearing Star Wars shirts, like standing in front of me? Like, you wouldn't really take me that seriously most often. But I have a lot of trauma related to my disability and how people have perceived me as a disabled people. And over time, I've learned from those experiences and I've built up resilience. And that's not to say that it's a good thing. I shouldn't have had to build up that resilience. It's not fair to people in marginalized populations that we expect them to be resilient rather than changing the problems in which they have to function. But I do carry those experiences with me. So although I might seem like a very small, non-threatening, goofy person on the outside, I am very strong. I know my worth. I know I'm confident in myself, and I know I'm capable.
I love it. And you're using your voice to help change the game for others, which I think is so important. As a youth advocate, what issues drive you the most? And do you believe that there are issues today that are not being discussed or given the attention that they deserve for this community?
That's a big question, because
Right.
there's so many things that we don't talk about, and there's so many things that we don't know that we don't talk about quite yet. What one quote that really drives me is by Angela Davis. She once said, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." So to me, that means don't accept the world as it is and see what it can be. So no matter what I'm doing, whether it's speaking, whether it's having a one-on-one conversation with a friend, with somebody who is in a professional environment, I try to see what that interaction could be. So I know that there's a lot not that we haven't discussed. I think that my focus at this point in my life right now is focusing on social disability as the social determinant of health. Because we know that disability does dramatically impact health outcomes, and it's easy to make that connection. But what about the perceptions of people with disability? Seeing me thinking, oh, who's that goofy guy in that corner? Like that changes how people will interact with me in the future. So I think that talking about the social aspects of disability and how we hold disabled people to lower expectations, that we don't provide disabled people with full access, I think that's something that we really need to discuss. That, and also I think quite a bit, unfortunately, because I am a young person growing up in a time of terrible, terrible climate change, I think a lot about how disabled people are going to be failed once we really see the impact of climate change full force.
Those are excellent points. Are there any issues that advocates might be focusing on that you think, like seasoned advocates still focus on, that you think might be outdated? Or is it mainly just like everything needs focus? It's all just getting different focus depending on who the advocate is.
Yes, everything needs focus all the time. It's up to us. We need to never stop, never sleep. No, like we do what we can with what we're given. I think that there's no such thing as an outdated topic so long as it's affecting one person. There, I coming at disability from a community perspective, I think a lot about my friends and the people who I've met who are disabled and hold other marginalized identities. And I remember this one quote that Tourmaline, who is a wonderful Black trans disabled activist, once said, "You try to change policies while we're trying to survive." So we can be fighting for these macro systems to change, but at the same time understanding this is a future change, this is preventative, but there are people who are suffering right now. And I think that that's a hard truth to hold, to balance that upstream, that macro, those laws, those bigger forces, and the downstream, social work, how medical, like people experiencing medical care currently. I think really holding those two truths at the same time, that they both need support, they both need change, is a difficult thing to grapple with.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm more of the micro lens, and being aware of things happening on the macro scale, it just seems like all hands on deck, doing everything for everyone as much as we can. I love it. So how do you feel like you inspire others through your self-advocacy? And what tips do you have for those who would like to do the same, be more involved in self-advocacy themselves?
Sure. So I don't approach every conversation with, oh gosh, how can I inspire people? I have a complicated relationship with the word inspirational, because what I view as my daily life, other people might view as inspirational. And I don't think I should be exceptional in any way at all. I think that in order to really connect with someone, you have to think about who you're talking to. You have to think about their values, their priorities. We all connect in one way or another. There is some kind of conversation we can have, even if we fundamentally disagree on politics, on everything else. So really thinking through what connects you rather than divides when presenting messages is quite important to me.
Mhm. Agreed. It sounds like you have a lot of confidence, experience, excellent skills. I'm curious how you've dealt with some hiccups when working with different people, different situations. Do you have any tips or strategies that you can share with others who might be experiencing some barriers?
Yes. Okay. I think that hiccups is a generous word. For everyone who's accomplished something over the course of their life, there are 20 million things that they have not accomplished. For example, in my bio, I was talking about how I was working on a comprehensive toolkit for people with disabilities in college. I had to drop that project. That was only a month ago. I have an entire resume of things that I started working on that I just had to drop or that never came to fruition. And that's difficult, but I learned skills from those, even if I don't have a final product to deliver. I think that focusing on what I've gained through these little efforts is important is really crucial to me in like understanding like, okay, I still did gain something from the situation, even though it doesn't seem to change the world. What can I carry this with moving forward? One example of that was I one time had a friend who was reaching out to me saying like, hey, I need resources from like this specific thing. And they are profoundly deaf and they did not feel comfortable using the phone. So I contacted a organization known as that's a suicide hotline for them. And as I was reaching out to them and trying to have a conversation, I realized like, oh my God, I can't really talk with them either. Like this organization is wholly inaccessible to this very large population. Like so many people are hard of hearing. Also, not to mention, suicide hotlines like are often contacted by people in domestic violence situations. Like there's an intersecting need right there. So I contacted the organization saying, hey, we have this need. We need to have it text-based chat. We need to have some kind of video-based chat, something to make sure that we're not missing an entire population of people who are in dire need of support. And so from there, I started working with that organization for 5 or 6 years, working on their communications team, making sure that we could expand the access. And I ran their suicide prevention text-based chat for quite a long time, for 2 or 3 years until I burned myself out. So that was just like that was one thing that I took from my own personal life, saying like, okay, well, my friends need support. How can I translate that into a more macro change?
I like that a lot. Yes. So this sort of this next question might already apply to what you've said, but I know that advocacy itself is tireless. It's very hard, worthy work, but it's hard. Is there something that you've accomplished that you are particularly proud of?
Ooh, gosh, I think that things that I'm most proud of are when I'm able to translate my personal experience, the experiences of the people I know, people who have lived experiences, and that is expertise into systemic change. So one example of that is I was working at an LGBTQ civil rights law firm. We were working on foster care systems for LGBTQ youth. Then we were trying to think about what protected classes. So protected class like gender, race, ethnicity, disability, all of that. We're trying to figure out like what kind of information should be included in this non-discrimination piece. And it occurred to me that my friend had told me like that even though being intersex is not a disability, that it strongly intersects with LGBTQ rights because intersex people and disabled people have genetic information that is different than what one would expect. So I weighed in. I mentioned my lowly paralegal self to this team of lawyers saying, hey, what about if we included genetic information as a protected class within this one very specific regulation? And we did. And because of that, like we recognized the intersection of disability and LGBTQ rights, and that was one thing that really drove me, because as a person who's part of both of those communities, I got to have a foot in both doors.
I love it. That's wonderful. Is there something that you've yet to accomplish that you hope to over the course of your career?
Oh gosh, graduate grad school, please. Just give me my degree so I can go. No, I think that one issue that affects me on my daily life, and also I see it like has pervasive effects on the deaf community, is how hard it is to get ASL interpreters. It's a burdensome, hard economic process, and the onus is like nearly always on the deaf person. So as a person who uses interpreters for all of my classes, I have every single one of those classes, I have to communicate with the interpreter ahead of time. I'm a full-time grad student. I teach a class at Berkeley, and this takes 10 hours of my week and countless emails. It's not fair. And I'm a person who has a lot of resources available to me. I'm remarkably privileged in where I'm at, but that's not always true. Like, deaf people are systemically underserved by larger society, like more unemployed, lower reading levels, and it doesn't have to be that way. There's nothing intrinsic about being deaf that means that a person will have a poor outcome. But even I, as a person who is doing incredibly well for myself, I struggle with this so much. And not to mention also the education I have to constantly be giving to the faculties, to my peers, even though I have an advisor who is specifically there to advocate for me. So I think that one thing I really like to address over the course of my career is how messed up these systems of ASL interpretation are, and how we need to make it more accessible.
Thank you for
You
sharing
can see
that.
Brian nodding over there.
He agrees. I thank you so much for sharing that, because my understanding as somebody who doesn't live this is that it is on the onus of the organization to provide these services, whether you are a small therapy office or a large UF health organization. You provide the interpretation services. Us, the agency does that, not the individual. So, but clearly that doesn't happen like when you're actually living this as consistently as it needs to be happening.
Absolutely. There's countless stories of people who can't go to their own doctor's appointments, who their hearing children have to interpret like their cancer diagnosis in medical systems, in medical places, like things that should not happen because of lack of education about how the ADA works, and also just assumptions about like what deaf people need rather than actually listening.
So given the scope of what we still need to do to advance a lot of these very worthy things forward, what keeps you motivated to be this taller person on the inside and keep fighting the good fight?
Yeah, so I would say that advocacy is a particularly hard field to be in. Every field has its own challenges, but advocacy is hard because you don't often see the outcomes change. You see the process constantly, you're fighting constantly, but it's so rare that you can see a tangible change resulting from it. So I think that what really keeps me motivated is seeing the community that results from these advocacy efforts. There's nothing as galvanizing as being in a room with other disabled people, people who just get it, not having to explain my existence to them. It's healing. It really makes it worth it at the end of the day, because I'm not just trying to fight these larger systems that are callous and not understanding, but I'm also connecting with people about it. I'm building my own community. I'm building my own world that I want to see in the future in that process.
Excellent. I thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. I hope that we have a long relationship together of advocacy, doing what is right for people. And I have a couple of questions that were in the chat. I think we have about 5 minutes left of our discussion. And Debbie Sains asked, how do you get organizations to see the worth of your skills when you're doing your advocacy work?
Yeah, so that is such a hard thing. And what I've been learning really throughout grad school is when you consider the values of the person that you're talking to, sometimes that does mean economic values. And it shouldn't have to be like that. I shouldn't have to be talking about, you should let me in the room because it will be cost effective. That hurts me. That feels awful. But sometimes that's how you need to communicate the message. So understanding what the person that you're talking to, the organization, what their priorities are, and trying to adapt.
I have my own question for you. So you're very clearly skilled at navigating this, regardless of how successful you feel you've been recently with developing your guide and everything. But I wanted to know where you had found this ability to learn to advocate. Did someone show you? Did you look this up? Do you have a mentor? What systems impacted you positively in order to be the advocate that you are today?
I can't attribute it to one thing, although I'd like to say that I was born a hard ass and you can't convince me otherwise. I am a result of the people who have invested in me over the years. For all of these terrible experiences that I've had related to my disability, I've had somebody in the corner fighting for me as well. I have chosen family who have not just modeled what it means to be resilient, they have supported me in my own growth and understanding of myself. So I could not have done any of what I have done alone.
Yeah. I love that. People are saying that that was such a beautiful answer, that you are a result of everyone who has invested in me. I think as a social worker and as a parent and as somebody who just cares about people, that is a beautiful way of showing how we impact and influence each other. Angela Miney had a question that said, there are some others who are attending today that are Masters in Public Health grad students as well, and students that are from other disciplines, but is there something that you would like to say to them as they get started in their careers, whether or not they are someone with lived experience or without?
My initial instinct is to respond with two answers that completely conflict with each other. So one is build a tough skin. Part of the challenge of working at advocacy is that there is not so much of a clear separation between my personal life and my professional. So there sometimes has to be a little bit of callousness. There has to be those boundaries in figuring out, okay, this is my work stuff. I'm going to leave this at the door and focus on my personal life so I don't burn out. But at the same time, talking about these issues that are deadly, that you have so much pain tied with them, it's easy to become too callous. I would say learn as we become more resilient, as we become more tough, still take that time to learn how to be soft. They don't have to be, gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Mutually exclusive. You can develop skills on both frontiers.
Thanks for that. Danita Gaynor has asked if she wanted to know, is there an easy way or place to find some of the magazine articles that you've been featured in, some of the work that you've done, because folks want to read it and see it?
Oh, that's so nice of you all. If you'd like to look up some of my work, I have a website. It's a Wix website. If you search Oliver Stabbe Wix, I'm sure it will come up. I also have a CV on LinkedIn. This is giving me motivation that I should actually put this all together and make it very clear. There's no, gosh.
Yes, we definitely need more self-advocates to use as resources for those who are learning and those who are trying to get started. And I'm sure you have plenty to share that folks would find value in. So thank you so much for doing that. When we find your website, I'll see that we add it to the chat so that others can include it and see everything that you're doing. But thank you so much for sharing your skills and your experience and your passion with us. We really appreciate you taking the time today.
And thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, with that, I believe we are heading to our next. Oh, someone, Faith Young, thank you so much for putting Oliver's website in the chat. Folks who are interested can look at that in our before our next session, which I believe we're actually going until 1:55. I thought it was 1:45. So if anyone else has some additional questions to fill the time, we can absolutely do that. If not, then we can end a little bit early and start our break a little early. Does anyone else have any questions for Oliver while we have him?
I'd also like to say before, before said Helen Money, I'm so sorry. That is my roommate. The way that I found this, I was presented this opportunity is her mother, Angela Money, was generous enough to extend the opportunity. I am so sorry, Angela.
No worries. And Oliver, this is Angela. I wanted to ask, I mean, I really appreciate you sharing your perspective today. And I know that your life is busy at the moment, so I really appreciate you taking the time, and I know it's early. But one of the things that you said that I was a little sort of paralyzes me in one sense is when we talk about systems change, because I, like our previous speaker, you know, I'm kind of just a mom and don't see myself as somebody who is able to change systems. So what kind of advice could you give to a middle-aged woman who is trying to make things better for, I guess, their own kids, and then dealing, so I'm trying to get back to the individual level. What can we do as individuals to bring about change?
That is such a good question. My first thought is to say every single systems change system change has been originated by the story of somebody. You cannot change anyone's mind unless you have a face to an issue. We cannot have systems change without individual level change. It's impossible, because you can say, yes, the world around us is not very good, and then the policymakers will be saying, yes, I agree. So I think that sharing your story, continuing to be outspoken, that is so important, and that is contributing to this larger change that we see.
I've never had this issue.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think we're hearing some crosstalk. Okay, sorry. Can you repeat that last bit?
Is it
Yeah, so I would say that any systems change that we see was originated in somebody sharing their story. And for people in the disability community, people who have loved ones who are disabled, we know the remarkable burden of having to repeat ourselves over and over and over again, and often oversimplifying our stories to make it more accessible to other people. And in some ways that we can feel like we've lost ourselves in that process, and it feels not that great. Like, it feels like, what am I doing this for in the end anyway, if I'm not getting exactly what I need? But I think that really thinking through the person that you're talking to, the person that you're sharing your story with, they will carry that with them, and they will tell somebody else, and they will tell somebody else, and it does spiral. And we don't see that spiraling happening in front of us, but advocacy requires trust and faith that other people will communicate what they've learned. So I think that storytelling is such a powerful tool in creating that macro system change.
Yeah, it sounds like you've used a lot of your individual advocacy and determination to advance that forward by sharing your story individually and then seeing them change things because of that story.
Yeah, just like, for one example, think about all of these laws that are named after individual people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they could not have happened if they weren't centered around somebody's lived experience.
Absolutely. And I know we spoke about this already, but keeping that motivation, keeping that drive, and pushing that advocacy effort forward on both the individual and larger scale it seems like it's, you know, all very, very interconnected.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something I think about quite a bit on a daily basis, because I would consider myself to be somebody who intervenes in macro systems like upstream's determinants of health. But I'm not even sure that's the right way to put it. Like, it's not just that when you slightly advanced from like individual level to organization level to policy level. It's not like that. Everything is so tied together. To ignore one piece of the puzzle means that you're not going to get the outcome that you're looking for. I'm seeing in the chat the ripple effect. Yes, absolutely. You can't say in the ponds like, okay, well, that cup of water is in that corner over there, and that cup of water is in that corner over there. It is all collectively making up a pond.
So if you're in a situation where you feel like you are on an individual level not being treated or focused on in the way that you feel like you should, that you deserve, how on an individual level with that person would you go about sharing your story or instituting that change? Would you like place calls to this person after the fact? Are you able to sort of assert yourself in the moment and say, well, actually, like how do you go about doing that when it happens to you?
It truly depends. There's so many intangible parts of just interacting with people that you can't quite say like, oh, I think that you would become incredibly defensive if I said, well, actually. Sometimes people need to hear it from other people, and I'm not the right source. And that's something that I am that's something that I think is both a strength, is a strength that I have. I know when I'm not the right person to be talking. Also, to talk about my experience as a disabled person and not name my whiteness and how people perceive me as a white disabled person who seems to fit these norms of able-bodiedness means that sometimes if a person would need to hear from a white person to have that sameness, yes, like I will be that person to step in. But other times, if we really want to be genuinely representing what is happening to people, it needs to come from somebody who holds all of these lived identities.
That's an excellent point. Yes, I feel like sometimes when you're in these privileged positions, advocacy can be both easier in some circles or more difficult depending on where you are, but a large part, I think, easier, you know, for most folks. Yeah, intersectionality is key. That's what the chat is saying. And yes, it is absolutely true. Oh, wow. Lots of great information shared today during our talk. I know we have a lot of things that we're looking forward to doing, and thank you so much for sharing your information with us. I can't wait to go look through your website and see what I can find to use with our folks. That we're trying to train a lot of our patients in clinic in order to, you know, be more independent and to advocate for things that they need. So if you have anything with that in mind, you can send it my way as well.
Absolutely will do.
Okay, guys. Well, we're going to end a little bit early, about a minute early, and we have a break right now from 1:55 to about 2:05. So we'll be back here at 2:05 for Networking Made Easy with Pam Kissendell and Danita Gaynor. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. And I appreciate our talk, Oliver. I hope to work with you soon.